Welcome to the Global Pulse, a short video series where our experts break down a trending topic in international business and why it matters to you.
I would like to talk about some research that I did with some colleagues of mine at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University on the impact of the U.S.-China trade war on trade between the two countries. The data we use is not data from the current trade war, but the trade war that was initiated in 2018 and lasted for a couple of years, 2018 and 2019. So in 2018, the U.S.-China began a trade war with a series of escalating tariffs on a wide variety of goods. Prior to that trade war in 2016, the U.S. average tariff on Chinese imports was about 5.3%. But by 2021, the rate had increased to 19.4%. At the same time, U.S. tariff rate on imports of goods from the rest of the world only rose marginally from about 4.9% to 5.4%. The tariffs on China were going way up, whereas tariffs on the rest of the world were fairly constant. In response to the higher U.S. tariffs, China increased tariffs on U.S. goods. Tariffs on U.S. imports into China were increased from an average of about 8% prior to the trade war to 20.7% in 2021. At the same time, China strategically reduced tariffs from the rest of the world, that is from imports from countries other than the United States, from about 8% to 6.7%. The purpose of the tariff increase is, I gather, was to reduce imports from China. And so we investigated in more detail how the tariffs impacted those imports from China, as well as how Chinese retaliatory tariffs had an impact on U.S. exports to China. And we think the topic is pretty relevant given the recent trade war or tariffs that the United States has instituted against many of its trading partners. The research questions that we asked were what types of goods were impacted by the tariff increases. Just to give you a timeline, and this trade war started in July 2018, and it continued on as a series of tariff increases that U.S. imposed on China and retaliatory increases that China imposed on the U.S. affected more and more products that were involved in trade between the two countries. By the end of, as I said, by the end of 2019, U.S. Tariff increases covered about 2/3 of imports from China, while China's counter tariffs covered about 58% of U.S. exports to China. The tariff war sort of ended in a truce in 2020. There was something called the Phase 1 trade agreement that suspended the last of the tariff increases. Although certainly at the end of the trade war during this truce, the tariffs remained higher than they were prior to the trade war, beginning of the trade war. So what was the impact of the trade war on U.S. exports to China and on U.S. imports from China? Well, we saw that, in fact, the impact was significant. But it was significant in a way that one might not have suspected. When the trade war was instituted and the tariffs went up, Chinese tariffs went up on U.S. exports, it impacted mainly U.S. exports that were shipped by ocean and not U.S. exports that were shipped by air. So basically, the type of goods that were impacted by the Chinese tariffs on U.S. exports were those that were sort of low valued and tended to get shipped by ocean. Higher valued exports from the U.S. to China that were shipped by air were not significantly impacted. On the other hand, U.S. imports from China were the types of goods that were impacted were actually the reverse. U.S. air imports from China were significantly impacted, but the U.S. ocean imports were not significantly impacted. So the low valued products that would come by ocean from China to the United States, well, those remained largely unaffected. But the higher valued imports that came by air, there was a reduction in those imports from China. The conclusion that we drew from this research was that the U.S.-China trade war had its desired effect. That is, it reduced trade between the two countries. However, it's clear that the type of shipments impacted depended on the direction of trade. Trade war largely impacted higher valued U.S. imports from China, that is, imports that are shipped by air. The lower valued ocean shipments from China were not significantly impacted. These lower valued imports from China may not have many alternate supply sources, so they may be relatively inelastic to tariffs. Trade war largely impacted lower valued U.S. exports to China, the type of exports generally shipped by ocean carrier. These commodity type shipments may be relatively easily replaced by commodity shipments from other countries. And we're seeing that in the current trade war. U.S. soybean farmers have experienced sort of significant decreases in exports to China, and China has largely replaced those soybeans with imports from South America, Argentina, and Brazil. On the other hand, air shipments to China were largely unaffected. And again, we're seeing that in the current trade war. Chinese still want the high-valued tech equipment from tech products from the U.S. And so in the last trade war, they continued to import those products despite the trade war. So the implications are, who's hurt by the trade war? Well, U.S. commodity shippers, such as shippers of farm products, and Chinese shippers of higher valued products, such as shippers of electronics. These are the types of shippers that need to diversify their export markets to avoid being squeezed during the current trade war and in future trade wars. Thank you very much.